China's war economy. The nature and the strength of China's economy is important for sustaining an arms race, for manufacture of weapons and munitions during a conflict, to generate the energy and the food necessary for the population to survive if China is blockaded. China's focus on economic development is driven by two imperatives. One, the improved socioeconomic well-being of its population in order to ensure the legitimacy of the communist regime. And two, acquiring the manufacturing, educational, health, and technological basis for a strong system of defense. Neglecting the well-being of the population can lead to internal instability, and failing to provide the material means for security has led to China's weakness being exploited in the past, often through long occupations and dismemberment. What you can see here is the dramatic change in the shift of the population in China from the rural to the urban areas. This was partially instigated by the government deliberately to create inexpensive labor for manufacturing in the 1980s and 1990s. And it had social costs because people would have the hukou from where they came, but not necessarily the hukou, which is the resident permit, to where they were going, which gave them less expensive access to health care, education, and other benefits. And so there is still some part of the population from that rural population that migrated that are not happy without having received full rights. However, a large part of those rural migrants have been reintegrated into the local population, and those that haven't are generally in their 50s and 60s now, so they don't pose an immediate threat to revolt. As well, many of them receive pensions from state-owned enterprises, which means it's not likely they're going to revolt. But one of the observations here is China still has about 500 million people living in the rural areas. Now, the rural area does not mean a farm. It could be small villages or small towns in the rural area. But essentially, those habitations are tied into the rural economy. I've seen some of the farms in China, and they're actually quite under-mechanized. China's agriculture is not as efficient as it could be. So some farms are very advanced. They have autonomous machines, but that's a very small minority of farms. Some of the farms still use animals or just use human labor, and many of the farms use what looks like upgraded John Deere equipment. In essence, not full-scale combines, but combines that are about twice the size of a normal tractor with attachments that would be put on it. The rural population is important for China because generally they're conservative, and it was from the troops in units that were sent into Tiananmen Square in June 4th, 1989 that were the most reliable, rather than the urban soldiers. So it's a recruiting base for the military, and especially given the modern state of mechanization and agriculture, the soldiers that come from the rural areas are probably better equipped to operate mechanical machinery like repairing tanks than urban populations. So here you can see China's current economic profile. In 2022, the US had a nominal GDP of 25 trillion. We're using GDP nominal rather than purchasing power parity, because purchasing power parity gives you the equivalent of certain items like food. So you can get a rough estimate of the relative quality of life given market forces, the size of an apartment. Now, most of the Chinese citizens I've spoken to think that there's been a significant improvement in the quality of life, particularly with regard to living arrangements. The apartments today might be farther from their place of work and farther from the center of the city, but they're much larger than they were 50 years ago. And so I've heard very few people complain about the progress. In fact, taking the speed train from Suzhou to Shanghai, you could see even the rural habitation has been completely replaced. Now, Jiangsu province is relatively wealthy, compared. I mean, for example, 90% of all wedding dresses in the world are manufactured in Jiangsu province. But very often rural areas are neglected, but they're not in China. So China's at 18 trillion nominal GDP. Now, again, nominal GDP is used instead of purchasing power parity because it better reflects military manufacturing and it better reflects relative trade power, the key instruments that are of interest when you're looking at international relations. The reason these numbers matter as well is for power transition. I mean, there's a theory that China will go to war against the U.S. once it's between 70 to 80% of the U.S. GDP. And it's not quite there. This would be at 72%. So it's not at 80%. But previous studies of power transition, the Wilhelmine Germans and the for example, the British in the First World War is taken as a measure. Here you can see Japan at 4.3 trillion, Germany 4 trillion, India 3.4 trillion, and the UK 3.2 trillion. When I first started teaching this class in 2000, the British economy was bigger than China's. Now, obviously, there's a distortion in there that doesn't fully reflect measurements. Now, you can see other countries that are catching up very quickly. Iran has caught up very quickly in its non-oil economy in the last 20 years, as has South Korea, which is going to approach Japan's GDP per capita quite soon. You can see how far Russia has fallen, and you can see countries like, of course, Indonesia, which is a very large population, catching up as well. It would no longer be correct to describe China as an agricultural country. It's the world's largest manufacturer and exporter of manufacturers. However, 30% of the labor is still focused on rural activities, and it's not the most efficient part of the economy. And it's likely to be like that for quite a few years to come. So China has a much larger portion of its population involved in the rural economy than most other even mid-level developing countries. Now, what China does have a major shortage of is arable land compared to the size of its population and the size of its territory. The U.S. has 157 million hectares of arable land. This is land that's put under cultivation. India is at 156, which is remarkable. India, which has a much smaller landmass than China, with the same population, has about 25% more arable land. China is comparable to Russia. Now, with climate change, countries like Canada and Russia might increase their arable land, and countries near the equator, where tropical soils will, might become susceptible to damage from the sun, you might actually have a decrease in arable land. Significant parts of northern Canada are the Canadian Shield, which are rough. However, some parts of the Russian Far East are not as rough. There's some volcanic soil, and there's parts of it that are not volcanic in the extreme Russian Far East. So it's very likely Russia will have an increase in the availability of its arable land. So China has to focus on creating a reliable food source out of the available arable land in the event of a crisis where it was cut off from foreign food commerce. Now, there have been theories for why China didn't industrialize before Europe, especially given the technological advances made by many of the Chinese citizens, some of whom were business people. And there have been theories that have looked at the coincidence geographically of, say, coal and copper and tin and food production. And that in China, on the Huanghe River, the Yellow River, where Xi'an is, coal was in a different location than where the food supply was. However, the Chinese did use coal early on for quasi-early industrial activity, but they never quite crossed over into mechanization, which was the particular type of industrialization that the British initiated in the 18th century. So many of the explanations for why China didn't industrialize, and Europe did. And this is an argument that's been made in part also with regard to South Asia, India, and the Middle East, is a focus on culture. So Asia was for a time poor, and it was attributed to one, bad governance, which was essentially the result of authoritarian regimes that were rent-seeking. They're seeking to keep themselves into power. They weren't seeking to increase the quality of life of their subjects. And two, a regressive socio-political culture, specifically Confucianism, which was believed to undermine the entrepreneurial spirit because it favored stability and therefore it favored farmers and the bureaucracy, and essentially just taxed the business community. It recognized the value of the business community, but it didn't want it to prosper. And as well, by strengthening the family, Confucianism undermined the state by eroding civil society and civil trust, which was the basis for contract. If you have no trust, you can't create contracts, and it's not possible to aggregate finance for large-scale profits. The anthropological term is called amoral familism. That is, people focus their energy on the family because that's where they're going to get their future spouse, and that's where property is protected. So if you marry your close or semi-close cousins, the property will always stay within the family, and that's where your security comes from in times of famine or in times of job loss. This is as opposed to individuals who give their allegiance to the state. And while the family is important, they're willing to believe in the state and then expect to get their livelihood from outside of their family and to create their property from interaction in the market, and they would get their spouse from outside the family. So now this is a problematic theory, because in the 1970s and 80s, when Japan's economy was growing very, very quickly, along in the 1980s with Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan and South Korea, Confucianism was also used as an explanation for why industrial manufacturing was growing so quickly in those states. And there the argument was the opposite, which is that Confucianism created a level of stability and social order that kept the population working in the factories rather than striking and other labor actions that were holding back Western countries in the 1970s. And so explaining the emergence of growth on the Pacific Rim, which had a very important impact on China, because the Chinese economic planners visited President Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore in the 1980s to find out how Singapore, which is essentially on a sandbar and has zero natural resources, it does not even have fresh water. It has to pipe it in from across the Johor Strait in Malaysia. And Lee Kuan Yew essentially advised that it was not only feasible but important when you're playing catch-up to have an authoritarian regime in order to carefully allocate the assets for development. So the rapid growth and industrialization of East Asia actually began with Japan in the 1870s, and then the development of the economies in the other Pacific Rim countries like Hong Kong, which started in 1945 and was essentially built on trade. Taiwan in 1949, which was a parts provider to Japan's economy. South Korea, which essentially started after there was a military coup in 1960, and there was a focus on economic development and how South Korea tied into the Japanese economy. And then Singapore, which provided an incredible story of being a port entrepot as well as refining fuels from its neighbor in Indonesia, which didn't have the technology. So there's a common feature for all of this development that China emulated. First, there was the political determination to develop and the presence of an autonomous and efficient bureaucracy. The political determination to develop could emerge out of a clear threat. Japan, for example, was constantly afraid of China, And Singapore was worried about a threat from Malaysia. In fact, Singapore received early advice from the Israelis on how to create a strong state. Or there were cases of military regimes seizing control to end civilian corruption and inefficiency. And this is the case in South Korea. Now, Taiwan never had a civilian regime. The military was controlling Taiwan from the moment the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949. But there was both incentives in these military governments to create the wealth necessary to create the factories, to create the tanks, to defend themselves against their communist threat. Number two, establishing order by suppressing organized labor, liberal rights, and democracy, thereby increasing labor mobilization, mobility, and productivity, and establishing discipline by supplanting traditional social norms and creating allegiances to the nation state. You know, it's thought that all you need to do is set up a factory, but labor needs to be trained to show up on time, to not constantly strike. In the US and Europe in the 1970s, there was a double-digit loss of productivity from constant labor action. The US solution in the 1980s was simply to open up their tariff walls to expose the US to international competition, and very quickly the need for efficiency led to those companies that were being held back by labor to fail. Number three, increasing the productivity of the population by imposing mass technical education and improving public health services. China was very successful in creating the equivalent of an Ivy League and of an A&M university in China, which focused on engineering. Other countries have done the same, but haven't quite been able to match the education system with opportunities in the market. Like India, for example. India's got a great many very efficient engineers. They do a lot of the construction for the Emirates in the Persian Gulf. But the same conditions don't exist in China, where you have the creation of capital by a central government. Saddam Hussein, who was the president of Iraq, a relatively brutal dictator, did receive the United Nations Award for Education in the 1970s for a very rapid increase in literacy in his population. And essentially it was coercive. He forced the entire population to learn how to read and write, and he forced the population, which was quite traditional, to send their children to school regardless of their religion or their traditions. The consequence was, in terms of sexual differences in the labor force, women had a lot more opportunity in Iraq than a great many of Iraq's neighbors. And in fact, the chief of Saddam Hussein's biological warfare program was an Iraqi woman who'd been trained in advanced biology. Number four, export-oriented growth to politically cooperative markets, which is, the case of Japan. And this is ultimately supplemented by substantial external investment. The US and the Japanese both invested heavily in Taiwan and South Korea, particularly in the automotive and the shipbuilding industry. Number five, transitions to democracy once the middle class's level of education resists labor discipline measures and the state needs greater levels of innovation. This is the transition South Korea did in 1988 and Taiwan did in 1996. I recall this period. Thousands of students, tens of thousands of students would be demonstrating once a month in the streets, demanding an end to privilege and corruption because they had achieved a level of education that made them better decision makers, particularly for innovation, than the government. And there was no surprise, both governments quickly adopted democratic forms of government, and today they're among the two most liberal regimes in the world, South Korea and Taiwan. Now, there is significant variation between these different examples. The domestic bureaucracy may either maintain an open market, like it did in Hong Kong, which was feasible because of the British legal system that they had inherited, which favored contracts, or supporting vertical integration, which is the Kaibal in South Korea, where you've got these very large companies like Hyundai, which are double-digit percentages of the entire economy that control all aspects of the manufacturing process. Or that they're financially backed by the government, which is searching for favored industries. This was done by MITI in Japan, as well as Singapore and Taiwan. So development in China followed in a different way, because it started from a much lower level of non-industrialization. It had, of course, come out of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, and the Communist Party spent the first 2 decades establishing very, very basic technology, railroads, opening up mines, opening up factories for manufacturing. So China's communism is essentially a development strategy of late developers, in which all capital is taken by the state and allocated for development. The civil police maintain order during this process. At stage 1, we have the communist period from 1949 to 1966. Here you're establishing political control, infrastructure, health, education, and heavy industry. You have the destruction of traditional feudal norms and the restructuring of Confucianism towards state obedience. There's a lot of communist activism that formed a part of this. Now, China didn't have much of a landowning class, and so although there was a demonstration made of punishing landowners, in fact, most of the absentee landlords were not able to access their property 20 years after the Japanese started their invasion. So there were not as many executions in China as there were in the Soviet Union, right after they established their communist government in 1918, 1919. During the Great Leap Forward from 1959 to 1961, there was a failed agricultural experiment to increase productivity for a food for manufacturing plant exchange with Russia, which failed. This demonstrated the poor technical training of the leadership. The number of deaths is often exaggerated because it's very difficult to calculate a population. And of course, China does not publicize how many people died, but it is estimated that 20 to 30 million people starved during that program. The second step was the Cultural Revolution. From 1966 to 1976, you had a period of social dislocation, but you did have continued development of education, health, infrastructure, and education. In fact, in the latter phase of the Cultural Revolution, from about 1970 to 1976, you basically had the fruition of the creation of a disciplined labor class that had basically been achieved between 1955 and 1965, and this meant that there was very rapid growth. In fact, China more than doubled its per capita GDP in just those 5 years. And so we see the true beginning of modern China then. And it comes down to something as simple as you had a critical mass of engineers and technicians, and people showed up on time. Agricultural growth was driven by new strains of rice, fertilizer, rural education. It resulted in a 300% increase in calories during this period. Despite slow general manufacturing growth, there is growth in key sectors of heavy industry such as shipbuilding and railways, and this sets the human capital conditions for later growth. So it was a form of import substitution industrialization, or ISI, where China's effectively cut off from global commerce, with the exception of barter trade with its allies. And so it's able to build up these industries without foreign interference. The third phase was under Deng Xiaoping from 1978 to 1992. Here, domestic development of energy infrastructure was the focus. In order to have factories, you need energy to be able to power them. The Cold War permitted China to open up to the West for trade, and here you see a big importation of technology and the beginning of the export-oriented economy. A lot of Chinese students went to study abroad in the West. A great many stayed in the West, but a great many also went back to China. There was also the adoption of the one-child policy in 1979. There was extensive but controlled mobilization of labor by freeing up rural labor to migrate to the cities to provide inexpensive labor for manufacturing and construction. So there was 260 million migrants in the 1990s alone. And this began the high growth period, but it started off at a very low magnitude. So in 2020, the British economy, as it was measured, was still on paper bigger than the Chinese economy. But in reality, it's largely because it's difficult to measure the Chinese economy. It's very likely that the English economy was never bigger than the Chinese economy. But what was measurable was bigger, essentially market-sold manufacturing. The fourth stage was under Zhu Rongji in 1993. He proposed that China partially restructure as a market economy, and this was adopted in 1997. This permitted China to leapfrog technologically. The state relinquished some control of capital allocation, as private investors who could obtain capital from the state banks are more efficient in generating development and growth in manufacturing and services. The persistence of the agricultural and state enterprises, which were large employers, so you couldn't shut them down, it'd lead to mass unemployment, continued to be important. Companies that did, for example, train or truck manufacturing, the heavy industries. High growth rates on the order of 7 to 10% created large increases in manufacturing capability from 1997 on. In the fifth stage, we have the 2000s. You have the reform of higher education to maintain human capital and encourage innovation. You have the school reforms, which are coded the 211 reform, the 985 reform, and the 2110 projects. China's high level of growth is exaggerated because it fails to measure the heavy investment in infrastructure that took place in previous decades that set the conditions for rapid growth. The next stage was in 2009. China's growth begins to slow due to labor shortages. China's absolute labor pool began to contract in 2012, which is a consequence of its one-child policy in 1979. There's simply too few workers and too many old people. This led to a movement of labor from manufacturing back to agriculture. The limit of extensive growth achieved through labor mobilization was exhausted, and productivity depended to a large extent on indigenous and imported innovation. Now, China suffered from low indigenous research and development. It was only 0.7% in that period, and depended on foreign firms for high technology exchange. China's growth has in large part been driven by aggressive investments. Attempts to shift to an indigenous developmental model by creating and relying on internal consumption and markets for consumption has been the focus since about 2009. Increased labor costs undermined China's labor cost advantage as foreign firms began relocating from China to India and Mexico. And this occurred during China's 12th five-year plan, which was from 2011 to 2012. In the seventh stage, we have the beginning of demographic stagnation. China's population shrank by 1 million in 2022. This slide shows the per capita income in US dollars. And you can see in red the rapid increase in per capita income during the latter half of the Cultural Revolution, which challenges the common notion that China was in complete chaos. It might have been chaos for the elite and for the educated classes, but the impact on production has often been overstated. So you can see in 1995, China had a per capita income still of 560, and that doubled in the year 2000. And by 2010, it had increased more than 500%. And by 2020, it had increased another 300%, an enormous amount of growth. But then it slowed down, as you can see in the latter end, because of COVID. So you can see this sort of bell-shaped curve of China's rapid increase in growth and then its slow decrease as it had to adjust in order to create innovation. Here you can see the real GDP per capita at 2010 prices going up to 2020. And you can see in particular China's rapid increase in per capita income. So it settles around 9,000 US dollars, which is the zone that is critical for having a irreversible democracy. So in theory, based upon all previous cases of democratization, no country that's achieved China's level of per capita income that has become a democracy has ever reverted back. Now, of course, there could always be a war or an economic crisis that causes the reversion. Certainly countries in the past that were democratic flipped their political system back to the previous political system. And China may be an exception for a variety of reasons. It's incredibly large, and so it can't be given a sufficient aid to save the government in a crisis, where smaller countries can receive much more support. Now you can compare it here to India, which is developing very quickly, and currently its growth rate is higher than that of China. But it has a big issue to deal with literacy. Only 75% of India is literate, and that really has a severe gender balance. About 60% of women are literate in India. That's enormous. 40% are illiterate. So China doesn't have that problem. And you can also compare this, of course, to Russia, which was an established manufacturing power during most of the 20th century, as well as Brazil. Here you can see China and its rail infrastructure. The most interesting part of the rail structure here is the rail line going from Lanzhou to Lhasa and going through Gansu all the way to Kashgar, which is China's extreme western outpost city that's been there essentially since the Han Dynasty. And was actually a gateway for Chinese influence in Central Asia. So China's got a lot of infrastructure. Now, this infrastructure is not necessarily efficient because it's essentially government funded. And so there's a sort of an inefficiency in terms of whether all of those lines can actually be afforded on their own under market conditions. Here's a comparison with the U.S. Rail network, which is very, very efficient, but it's driven entirely by market concerns. And so the U.S. history, of course, is a long series of railway bankruptcies and reconsolidations. Just as a comparison, the older American railway system with China's very new railway system. So, future economic development issues. Number one, capitalist corruption. There's a concern that the Communist Party may become corrupted by private capitalists, but the Chinese Communist Party has taken measures. 20% of billionaires that are identified by the American Forbes magazine are imprisoned annually. This was the case from about 2010 to about 2016, 2017. Xi Jinping's focus on anti-corruption is very popular in China precisely because of this. The Chinese fear of a return to corruption that then leads to weakness. And this is a part of Chinese historiography. After Deng Xiaoping, the first Chinese president was Jiang Zemin, and he heralded from the Shanghai Gang, and they had, to the extent that Communist Party officials can have business links, he was representing strong business concerns. And there was a fear that that type of business party interaction would lead to the corruption of the Communist Party. So there's a concern that the Communist Party may seek to remain in control despite there being an impediment to economic growth, as well as the fear that they could be essentially influenced by the business class. And it's certainly not the first time. If you look at Russia after its collapse in 1991 and the impact that oligarchic business has had on the instability in Russia, Chinese fear a very similar outcome. A second issue is middle-class activism, the concern that growth will push an emerging middle class to push for democracy before China's completed its period of growth. Now, the logic from the West is that middle classes are more efficient at allocating resources, to become educated, they're able to bribe officials, they're able to out-organize the government, and eventually they demand democracy. Really, self-representation for an oligarchic business class that later gets spread to the rest of the population as they also acquire sort of class power and organization and education. China doesn't feel development is fair. Most of the Western countries developed when there wasn't universal suffrage in their country. Certainly England did. And this made it a lot easier because you could suppress labor. So for China, it's a race to develop before the middle class demands power, which it did in, say, South Korea and Taiwan. And so, my instinct is that this is inevitable. Now, it's an issue also for democratization because it's thought that middle classes want democracy, but it's equally likely, and you see this phenomenon in countries like Mexico and Brazil, it's equally likely that when you have a middle class that is investing in manufacturing and their prosperity depends on the control of labor, they will actually support an authoritarian government in order to keep their advantages. And this is definitely the sentiment of French manufacturers in the 19th century of France. And so the oscillating class warfare in France showed a middle class that was essentially anti-democratic. A major issue for most of the developing world is not starting manufacturing and getting a growth rate from that. The major concern is the middle income trap. A great many developing countries begin to develop, they have high growth rates, then they hit a crisis and they can't grow anymore. Now the standard is, of course, the per capita income of Western countries. You know, a country like, for example, Canada, which is around $40,000 per capita per year, or the US, which is about 50. You got some extreme cases of $70,000 per year capita income in Norway and Luxembourg or Switzerland. But generally speaking, the Canadian or the American standard of 40K is what they're going for. The middle income trap occurs when a country hits about 10,000, and China's almost there. Now the Western response to that is, well, the problem is almost always institutional weakness. These countries have strong institutions for authoritarianism, but they lack strong institutions for the rule of law. The judiciary must be strong. It must be aggressive. It must move against the interests of any particularist elite. And it must guarantee the Constitution. But the lessons learned that authoritarianism is very efficient for starting the early stages of manufacturing industrialization are contradicted by the needs of efficient representation, allocation of capital, innovation, and the need to create a judiciary that guarantees contracts. So in Beijing, there's a concern that China's centralized development and inefficient market structure will lead China to become a stagnated middle income trap country. So this would arrest the per capita income at approximately $4,000 to $10,000 per year. And examples of this income level trap are Turkey, Argentina, and Thailand, for example. The Chinese Communist Party is concerned that the solution of liberalizing the economy further may lead to further demands for democratization. States arrested at the middle income gap trap can suffer from domestic and social and political instability. The Chinese economy will need to afford the maintenance cost of this massive infrastructure investment. Now, there's also something called the high income trap. Japan's economy was getting very, very close to the American economy in the 1980s. In fact, Japan achieved 60% of the US GDP in the 1980s. It caused a shock to the US and led to a lot of domestic economic and market reforms and duty reforms in the US. However, in 1991, Japan's economy started to stagnate, and Japan has almost not grown in 30 years since 1991. It suffered massive deflation. So that's a second issue, which is Japan, even though it produces per capita wise the most patents in the world, far more than the US, it's not able to leverage the very well-educated population into innovation. So even Japan has struggled with technological innovation. Companies like Sony and Toshiba have been eclipsed by Korean manufacturing in the beginning of the 2000s. So you can see below two different scenarios of what could happen in the future in terms of escaping the middle income trap. Whether Asia and other developing countries are going to stagnate, or whether Asia is able to break through and make the institutional innovations to create a judiciary that will support non-corrupt market behavior, relatively speaking. Here's a representation of the middle income trap in those countries that were able to escape. So you can see here both Japan in the 1960s and South Korea in the 1980s were able to avoid the middle income trap. And in fact, in the year 2023, Korea has effectively caught up to Japan's per capita income, which is remarkable. And it's quite clear that a democracy like South Korea's, which imprisoned its own president over corruption, demonstrates that a strong, efficient judiciary is the prerequisite for overcoming this obstacle. So this is going to be a challenge for the Communist Party, which does not recognize an independent judiciary. This is a best case scenario. If China's able to overcome the middle income trap in the year 2050, its GDP will be about half of that in the United States, which is about $40,000 US, which is what Canada has today, which is entirely feasible given the high levels of education and the public order in China and the good infrastructure. The fourth issue are widening income levels. The Gini coefficient measures the relative difference between the wealthiest and the poorest members of a society. And if it's too great a disparity in the Gini coefficient, this can lead to social instability, including crime. Now, given the Communist Party's commitment to good governance and social justice, ensuring this does not become too great is an important objective. However, Gini coefficients are generally eroded during periods of economic growth, and China's Gini coefficient demonstrated that there was the creation of a very wealthy upper class, and you could see their antics, or at least the children of these wealthy people. You could see their antics on TikTok. A low value demonstrates the greatest wealth distribution, and a high value the greatest disparity. So you've got countries like South Africa at 0.63, which are pretty severe, and countries like Sweden, 0.23, which are quite equal. Although it should be pointed out that Sweden's got the most billionaires per capita for a large European country. Now, what we've seen with China is a decrease in the Gini coefficient. In other words, there's been a dramatic redistribution of wealth in China, which is a function, the positive function of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption policy, where he's targeted corrupt government officials and corrupt business practices. And in some cases, people have been executed, particularly those involved in finance. So China's alleviated the Gini coefficient problem, and it doesn't look like it's going to be a problem. In China, there's a general sense that of the positive value of equality, and that the current government has achieved it. A major challenge for China is moving up the product cycle. As China becomes more educated, as its population has a higher income, Chinese exports are no longer competitive with other countries that have achieved similar levels of education and technology in their population. And so China will move up. Japan has experienced the move from basic manufacturers to automobiles to high technology. Taiwan and Hong Kong went through the same process. So China is encouraging competition for its manufactured exports from other states that have a higher labor cost productivity ratio, or lower costs. In 2013, for example, Bangladesh overtook China in clothing exports. Export-oriented states generally need to sell higher technology items to maintain their market share in the target market. This often needs technological and business innovation that requires economic liberalization that in turn can create pressure for political liberalization. China's S-curve growth is a function of it catching up economically, but then this decelerates quickly. Major important inputs to being able to successfully move up the product cycle is education. And here we see a very large increase in the number of science and engineering bachelors being granted in China between 2000 and 2012. So one of China's greatest successes has been the very rapid creation of an education system that supports science. Now, we should not be deluded by this crude measurement. The Soviet Union had a lot of engineers and spent a lot on research and development during the Cold War, but the market conditions were not right to sustain the type of investment you needed for innovation, and so it failed. It's not enough simply to have a lot of engineers. They must be able and incentivized to work. Otherwise, someone will go and do engineering, and then they'll, once they graduate, they'll take up a non-engineering related job. We can see here again doctoral degrees in science and engineering. Now sometimes this is actually a fairly expensive way of acquiring a skill that's not very useful in the market. And so a science PhD should typically be somehow associated with either funded research in the university system like in the US, or with corporate links, or corporate research as it is with pharmaceuticals or in countries like Germany. Now we can see again a huge leap in the number of PhDs between 2000 and here 2012 in China, and the relative stability everywhere else. And we can see a slight rise in South Korea and Taiwan. And again, the fact that Taiwan and not China, or Taiwan and not the US, not Singapore and not Holland, were able to master microchip development shows that it's not the number of engineers, but rather the specialization. And so there's a lot more variables here at play if a country's going to create an industry of excellence. Here's the gross expenditure on research and development. Now, the US in the 1980s, to try to figure out the puzzle of why the Japanese were outperforming the US in terms of the growth of manufacturers like automobiles and shipping and other heavy goods, focused on, in Japan in particular, the statistical use of quality control, but also the amount of research and development that the Japanese were investing. And it was true, the US invested less, but once the US was aware of the problem, they became very competitive. But again, it's the raw score of research and development is not enough, because Japan persisted in spending a lot of research and development even after their economy began to stagnate in the 1990s. And so again, there has to be a market outlet for this research, otherwise it's wasted. And in Japan in particular, it's very difficult to start a startup. In China, there have been a lot of complaints about the red tape at the local level, even if the central government is encouraging small enterprises to create innovation. Here again is research and development expenditures as a percentage of the GDP of different countries. You can see the US, it's quite far ahead. Japan and South Korea, they're quite far ahead. But you know, as we know from the cutbacks from large companies like Google in 2022 and 2023, the first thing they're going to cut are some of the research and development programs. And so this is a part of the corporate interest that is dropped in times of business crisis. Here also you can see the Chinese exports as a share of GDP, and this is important and it's intentional on the side of China. China had a very large economy directed for external exports. It's come down now to the same approximate level of both Japan and Germany, which means exports are very important, but China's trying to create domestic consumption, and a larger and larger part of its economy are services and lighter industries that sell to the Chinese population. Here we can see an attempt in China to create a consumer-driven economy, and the blue line is primary industry. This is basically agriculture, and the secondary industry you can see is mining. It's still very, very important. But the tertiary industry, which focuses on finance and other services, is the one increasing, and it's now the largest part of the Chinese economy as of about 2014, 2015. Agricultural stagnation. There's been a lot of innovation in agriculture in China in the 1970s. 1978, in China, ended the commune system and gave permission for a family household system so that families could use property to manufacture agricultural goods, not in all cases, but in many cases in the villages, without the permission of a central authority. So this permitted peasants to grow cash crops, which made them wealthier and allowed them to improve rural infrastructure. It could undermine food security, however. Now, China's population was approximately 47% rural in 2000, which was down from about 80% in 1970. But on average, a family lives on a single acre of land without mechanization in the form of tractors and are farming relatively inefficiently. This is very similar statistically to Haiti. So in some ways, probably a half to a third of Chinese agriculture is as efficient as agriculture in Haiti. By comparison, the number of acres per farmer in South Korea is 3 for Taiwan, 30 in Europe, and 300 in the US, where you have large corporate agriculture. Mechanizing Chinese agriculture would significantly increase productivity, reduce China's imports, but would displace about 400 million people that would need to be integrated into urban areas without creating poverty and social dislocation. This is like the enclosure movement in England, which ended the Roman practice of sharing common land. This occurred in England in the 18th century, and it led to capitalist focus on agricultural development and led to a huge increase in efficiency. China is not even at that stage of restructuration. And tragically, it looks like China is going to have to go through a phase where large corporations begin buying up and evicting Chinese farmers off their land in order to increase efficiency. Politically, this is a very difficult step, and China's not yet taken it, because it could trigger very high rural unemployment that could lead to instability. Problem number 7, labor shortage. The 1979 one-child policy and materialism in the coastal areas of China has driven down the population growth rate, reducing the available level of labor. In the 15 to 64 age group, we see a decline in China starting in 2013, which is indicating that China doesn't have enough workers to support the large number of dependents. China reduced its one-child policy to a two-child policy in 2016, and then a three-child policy in 2018, and then in 2021, China canceled any limitations on the number of children in order to encourage its population to have children. The total fertility rate in comparable countries is 1.2 in Taiwan, 1.36 in Japan. This is the total fertility rate, which is the number of children per woman. And in China, it's 1.7 in 2022. None of these are at replacement rates, which means the population will begin to decline. Furthermore, increasing female education has driven up the average age of marriage, causing what in Chinese is called leftover women. And there's also been a substantial increase in divorce, further reducing the frequency and the strength of the family unit. One of the social consequences is the relative aging of the population and the responsibility of a single grandchild to take care of their aged parents and their 4 grandparents. So China's arrived at what's called a Lewis turning point, where there's no extra rural labor to drive growth. It's simply run out of population, but it doesn't yet have the per capita income to use mechanization. China's not the only country to suffer this, and obviously one of the alternatives is immigration, but it's not clear what China is willing to do. In South Korea, which is fairly strict with regard to immigration, nevertheless, the number of rural wives in South Korea that are foreigners has reached 20%. So the government of Korea has had to introduce Korean languages so that their wives, mostly from Southeast Asia, in rural South Korea, would be able to communicate with the rest of the population. You can see here the population tree and how it's stubby at the bottom. And that small stubbiness at the bottom has to support the large population at the top, possibly over the age of 65 for the current generation. When health in the long term increases, then people could be continuing to work until age 70 or even longer. Now, if we were to make a comparison in terms of development, China's grown much more quickly than India. India's democracy and bureaucracy are relatively inefficient. And the slow emergence of import substitution industrialization in India has undermined the control of labor and measures against corruption. So India has institutional problems. However, it has a much younger population, which means in at least for the next 2 or 3 generations, India is going to be able to rely on cheap labor in order to make its exports productive, and doesn't have the problem of a shrinking labor class having to provide the resources to take care of a retired dependents. Here you can see the number of births per woman. China used to have 6 children per woman average in the mid-1960s, and that in 1979 they imposed the one-child policy, and there's a significant drop. People, if they're minorities, they could have more than 1 child, and very often people had 2 children, and then they would sort of sneak off and have one of their relatives raise the other child. You can see the consequence for the sex ratio at birth, which was worsening, but now is becoming less severe than it was in the 2010s. And you can see here the different dates for the different child policies. Here you can see China's working age population, and as the percentage of the population, and the working age population is essentially starting to shrink, and this is problematic for China. The numbers at the bottom are the different decades of the 21st century, and so you can see a pretty precipitous decline for the next half century for China. China's population today is less useful than under past regimes, and so you can see the even by 2015, 1/5 of the population was aged 55 and older, which made China relatively old compared to other countries in the international system. Here you can see Chinese aging projections. By 2050, 1/4 of China's population will be at the age 65 and older, which will put it on the same level as Japan. And the Japanese conclusion is their large proportion of dependence in the economy, in the population, is directly responsible for the stagnation of the economy. Chinese economic issues. Number 1, oil dependence. If there was a blockade of China, it's been estimated that there would be a 12.5% decrease in China's economy almost immediately. So that would imply being cut off from markets in the US and Europe, and China having to trade terrestrially or trade only with its allies. Now, China's had a large increase in motor vehicles. So we can see that in 1990, China only had 6 million automobiles, and the US had 189 million. Only 17 years later, the US had gone up to 247 million automobiles, and China was at 80 million. That's more than a 10-fold increase. Both countries equalized about 2020. Now, the US has got about 257,000 kilometers of highway. China went into a heavy infrastructure investment of both trains, ports, and highways. And so in 1999, it had only 6,000 kilometers of highway. That increased to 65,000 in 2010 and 169,000 in 2020. It's still short of the amount of highways the US has, but in some ways China's population is more concentrated, and so it doesn't need that many highways. And it's got more commuter trains for convenience. All of this means that China needs a lot of oil. And the green ovals you can see on the map are where China's principal oil is within its territory. A significant part of it is in Xinjiang in the Tarim Basin. By 2010, China was importing about 10 million barrels a day to sustain its economy. Now, China is supporting the green economy because it doesn't want to be dependent on fossil fuels from abroad. So there's a lot of investment there, but as we'll see later, it's not yet a significant part of the economy. And of the millions of cars on Chinese roads, just a few million are electric. So even there, the impact of electrification is just at the beginning for China. This is oil production per country. What you want to notice is that the largest oil producer in the world is the United States. Most of U.S. oil stays in the U.S. But countries like Saudi Arabia, which is just behind the U.S., or Russia, they export a lot of their oil. Now we can see China on the top right, and it's got about a quarter or about a third of U.S. oil production. China consumes all of its oil. And you can see some countries like Japan and many of the European states that are very dependent, with the exception of countries like Norway and the United Kingdom. So this is the system in 2022 that China is dealing with. It depends on importation because its consumption of oil is very, very high. In fact, it's exceeded the importation that the U.S. imports, and so it depends on political stability to be able to import from countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the Emirates, the Russian Federation, and African oil producers like Angola, for example, and Sudan. On the left, you can see again another demonstration of the oil production. This is in 2021, and you can see that the U.S. is far ahead of Russia and Saudi Arabia, about almost 30% more, 40% more production. Saudi Arabia is slightly ahead of Russia, and again, you can see how little China produces. It produces about the same as more than the Emirates, less than Canada. So on the right, we can see Saudi Arabia at the top has the largest oil export. So this is different from production. Obviously, the exports are important for China because countries are competing on the market to buy the fuel contracts they need to be able to fuel their economies. So we have Saudi Arabia as a top exporter, followed by Russia. Then we've got Iraq, then Canada. Canada obviously has a small population relative to other countries. Then we've got the Emirates, Nigeria, Iran, Kuwait, Norway, Kazakhstan, Angola, and then the values of that export drop significantly. So there's not a huge amount of exports. Countries like the U.S., which are the leading manufacturers of oil, don't export it. They keep it within their borders. Here again, you can see the millions of barrels per day production, and we can see that Saudi Arabia is on the top, followed by Russia, which has invested heavily in its oil industry. And at the bottom, you've got Iran, Nigeria, and the United Arab Emirates. Iran is constantly under sanctions, which is disrupting its importation of technology. And well, Nigeria and the Emirates have just natural resource limitations. But this is the market that China is buying from. Here again, we've got the level of imports, and we can see China by far is the biggest importer of oil in the world. It imports about 30 or 40% more than the US. And then there's India, and then you've got South Korea and Japan, and then Germany, then Spain, and then you've got a large number of European countries. China, therefore, is very dependent on imports. It imports a lot, it doesn't produce a lot, and the oil that it imports comes from quite far away. Its peer competitor, the US, can generate most of what it needs domestically, or it could buy oil from Canada or Mexico, which are just adjacent. India buys from the same source as China, which is Saudi Arabia and Iran in the Persian Gulf, but India is much closer to the Persian Gulf and therefore much more difficult to interdict or blockade India from the Persian Gulf oil. These are the oil reserves in billions of barrels. You can see a recent development in fracking and the increased price of oil has allowed more expensively extractable oil to enter the market as being in reserve. So there's lots of oil in the world. The problem is how much money the market is willing to bear to extract it. And under current costs, Venezuela is now the leading country for oil reserves, followed by Saudi Arabia and then Canada. You can see China and the US both don't have a lot of oil, But again, with technology, it's very likely the U.S. could probably find another method for obtaining that energy source. This is important because we could actually anticipate oil running out at a market price that makes it convenient, or at least more convenient than electric, in about 50 or 75 years. And all of that was within the time frame of China's development. In the event of a conflict, China can't have electric tanks. It's simply not feasible. It could use coal domestically to fuel its power plants for its domestic population to resist a blockade or a shortage of oil. But in a conflict, oil is what's needed in order to conduct a conflict, and it's not clear that China would have enough without help from, say, Russia or Central Asia, which have significant reserves. Here's China becoming the top crude oil importer in 2017. China's actually the color in red. You can compare it with Europe and the US. Yellow is India, purple is Japan, and green is the rest of the world. So you see a huge increase, essentially a doubling of the importation of oil from the 1990s, which is about 30 years ago. So here is a breakdown of the different sources of energy in China in 2021. And so what you can see is overwhelmingly 80% of China's energy use is coal, which are burned in plants that generate electricity for heating and for manufacturing. Oil is about 20%, and this is obviously for the automotive industry. Hydroelectric power is probably around 5%, along with gas, which is brought in by ship as liquid or also piped in. And then you see very small wind energy, nuclear energy, solar. India, for example, has a much larger portion of its energy provided by nuclear. So China is technologically advanced, but it's actually behind India by several decades on experience with using nuclear reactors for energy. So here's China's crude oil imports by source in 2021, and this matters, of course, for strategic reasons. Half of all Chinese oil comes from the Middle East that are imported, and that's 17% Saudi Arabia and 11% Iraq. Here it shows no Iran, although in some years it did. China has, of course, a difficult relationship because on the one hand it wants to associate with Saudi Arabia, on the other hand it wants to associate with Iran for strategic reasons and energy reasons, and the two are not compatible. So you can see Oman 9%, Iraq 11%, which is significant. Some US oil, probably specialized types, are exported to China. 15% is Russia, including another 1% from the former Soviet Union, which would be the Central Asian states. And you can see a significant amount of oil comes from Angola. So these have political implications for China in the event of a conflict. Now, one of the big issues is, well, could China simply invade Russia and take the oil? There are proposed new discoveries of oil that you can see here in Yakutia and near Lake Baikal. But that's really where you have the first large concentrations of Russian people. Irkutsk is the lake that you see directly in the center. It's Lake Baikal next to the city of Irkutsk. And to the west of Lake Baikal and Irkutsk, you have a fairly large Russian population. So it would be difficult for China to invade and for Russia to not resist. In the Russian Far East, which is mostly to the east of Lake Baikal, perhaps to the north in Yakutia, there is oil, and certainly there is some on Sakhalin Island, which has been of interest to Russia and Japan. You can see that off in the island on the extreme right side of the map here. But most Russian oil comes along that blue pipeline that you see, which is currently feeding into China's distribution network. And those fields are very far from the Chinese frontier. They're just east and north of the Ural Mountains. And so they're a core part of Russia. It'd be very difficult for China to invade and capture the oil. So there's no easily conquerable oil just across the Russian border in the Far East. China, of course, gets its oil from the Persian Gulf. Some of it at times came from Iran, although Iran's having difficulty extracting the oil because of sanctions against extractive technologies, and Saudi Arabia certainly is not going to be helpful. So China's got the same dilemma the US had during the Cold War, which is ensuring that the oil continues to flow. And Iranian threats to close the Straits of Hormuz are obviously against the interests of China and Japan and most of the Pacific Rim countries and most European countries. And so Iran would be very unlikely it would ever have an approval to close the straits unless China was not receiving any oil from the Persian Gulf because of a US naval blockade. China had some negotiations with Sudan, particularly South Sudan, which was exporting oil, but that oil, of course, is exported through Sudan itself. So it's very difficult for China not to get involved in regional issues when it comes to ensuring a supply of energy. This is the South China Sea. It was thought for a while that there was extractable gas or oil in the region. There's some exploration going on, and some small amounts of gas are being extracted by countries like Brunei, but in general there's not a lot of oil there. But this is the region through which the supertankers go carrying the oil from the Persian Gulf. And this, of course, is problematic because the oil coming to Japan would also go through the South China Sea that China claims, and the oil going to China could be easily blockaded at the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, which you can see on the bottom left of the screen. Here again is a depiction of the Russian oil regions. The orange-brownish region indicates where Russia has current oil production. And you can see it's actually fairly far west and adjacent to European Russia. And there's prospective oil in Yakutia, which is the green area in the essentially the center of the map. So perhaps China would have an incentive one day to retake parts of the Russian Far East that it once controlled, and then to make a bid to control this region of oil, but this region of oil has not yet been exploited and developed. These are the different oil locations in Central Asia. This is Kazakhstan specifically. Kazakhstan has fossil fuels along with Turkmenistan, and China is obviously interested in ensuring a stable oil supply in the event of a blockade, and these are candidate suppliers. Coal is also very important. China has about half as much coal as the US and a little bit less coal than Russia, but otherwise it has an enormous supply. The problem with Chinese coal is it's called brown coal, and it burns much more dirtily than US coal. So China actually imports a lot of American coal because it makes the environmental issues in China less problematic. And as long as China is able to convert coal safely and in a way that doesn't damage the environment and deals with the issue of carbon capture, that might be a long-term solution for China. It could certainly engage in liquefaction where it converts coal into oil in the event of a conflict. But although China does not have a lot of oil, it has an enormous amount of coal which would last China a very long time. These are natural gas resources and sources in China. There are about 250 nuclear reactors in the world, most of them providing energy. Some of them are military weapons production, and a smaller number are research reactors at universities. China aims to build 150 for China alone. Compare this to the 92 that is possessed by the US. At the moment, China's got 50 reactors, of which there are 15 energy producing sites and another 20 reactors that are expected to be put under construction. Here you can see the locations of the reactors on the coast, and the planned reactors, which are meant to bring cheap energy to the interior of China, particularly near large cities. So a second economic issue is China's maritime dependence. About a quarter of all containerized cargo trade contains goods being exported or imported to or from China. 90% of China's trade is by shipping. Now, this is not unprecedented, as during the Ming period, China was a major maritime commercial exporter. But at the time, China was lacking a strong navy, as it did until quite recently, when China engaged in its naval military buildup. So China is to some extent dependent on other naval powers as well to maintain the freedom of the oceans for commercial navigation. But it is nevertheless vulnerable to a blockade because the U.S. and its allies have a much stronger naval force, especially as you leave the Chinese littoral and go deep into the Pacific or the Indian Ocean. You can see here the major coal trades, the grain trades, and the iron ore trades, and you can see the commercial shipping and the different ports that are friendly to China in the Indian Ocean, like Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Gwadar in Pakistan, Djibouti in the Red Sea. So China has engaged in some provocative acts. This here is a Chinese flotilla that departed from Sanya and then patrolled through various straits of Indonesia. China's done this with many of its neighbors, and it's generally viewed as aggressive, even if by the standards of international maritime law, China has the right to innocent passage even with warships. But it does illustrate the incredible terrestrial potential for blockading China that is a concern to policymakers in Beijing. So here you can see China's foreign trade in 2020, and its largest trading partners are actually the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, followed by Europe and then the US. Of course, ASEAN is all of the countries in Southeast Asia, from the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar. So that's a significant market. So it's not true that China only does long-term trade, or that China's largest trading partner is necessarily the U.S. But this does show the dependence China has on the maritime routes for its commerce. So China's major import sources are the rest of the planet, but Taiwan in 2021 was the largest single source of imports by value. So this is obviously the high-tech industry, followed by South Korea, then Japan, then the US. So this is obviously post-Donald Trump, where he readjusted the terms of trade by putting up tariffs in an attempt to reindustrialize the US. So China lost market share. Then there's a significant amount of trade with Australia. That is, of course, minerals and foodstuffs. And then Germany, Brazil, Malaysia, and Vietnam. China's major export destinations are the US, followed by Hong Kong. Hong Kong is really an entrepot, and it gets reshipped to other parts of the world. So it's typically Shenzhen in Guangdong province being redirected to Hong Kong. And then you've got exports to Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Germany, Netherlands, India, and the UK. So China's basically exporting to those countries that can afford the goods that China's exporting. These are China's principal ports. They basically go up and down the littoral. And you can see here the shift between 2005 on the left and 2021 for the major ports in the international system. Shanghai is the world's busiest port, followed by Singapore. Now it's an entrepot, which means many goods being shipped from China could be re-warehoused in Singapore, put on a ship, and then it would be transshipped to another location. But in fact, it's simply Singapore acting on behalf of China, or reselling a good they purchased from China. And then you can see all the ports that are the busiest are Chinese until we get to Busan in South Korea, and then Hong Kong, and then finally Rotterdam, which is the main port of Europe. And you can see the top 20 container ports by sea cargo traffic in 2020 on the other side, which is largely consistent as well. And you see that the two U.S. ports are Los Angeles, Long Beach, and New York, and they're significantly got less activity than the Chinese ports. So here you can see very broadly the oil supply chain going to China with that blue line coming out of the Persian Gulf and coming out of suppliers like Libya through the Red Sea, and it goes across the Indian Ocean along the Chinese coast, and it goes through the Malacca Strait or the Sunda Strait or the Lombok Strait through the South China Sea onto China, and then onto South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and other countries. So this is a very precarious supply chain for China. There is many choke points which could make blockading China not very difficult. Now, China has invested in a port of Gwadar in Pakistan, and you can see there a proposed red arrow through Saindak, which would be a link between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China. But the Karakoram Highway, which links Gwadar to China, doesn't have sufficient throughput. I mean, it's basically a highway with a pipeline on it going through the Hindu Kush, which are the foothills of the Himalayas. It doesn't have the same throughput of a large ship. And so it would be, and even then Pakistan, if China's being blockaded, it's just as easy to blockade Pakistan's access to Persian Gulf oil. You can see here a graphic volume representation of the quantity of oil and how it gets squeezed into the Strait of Malacca as it passes through the South China Sea. About 17 million barrels of oil go through the Straits of Hormuz every day, and then another 15 million barrels go through the Strait of Malacca. You can see the port of Gwadar, different angles of it. You can see the map of it. It's near the Iranian border, and it has been under attack from the local Baloch, who are hostile to Pakistan's colonial treatment of the local population. There's also a proposed infrastructure link, road and for energy, through Myanmar into Kunming and then Nanning in China. Again, Myanmar, if the Persian Gulf is blockaded, then it'd be quite easy to blockade Myanmar as well. And again, you can see the China string of pearls that was depicted before. We have Kyapiu in Myanmar, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and Gwadar in Pakistan. This is the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka. The issue there was China loaned money to Sri Lanka to build the port, and then Sri Lanka was not able to repay the loan, and then China was able to take over the port in lieu of payment of the loan. And so for the U.S., this is a concern that China was using its economic power to acquire physical control of various ports, which they've done. There are Chinese companies that are indirectly linked to the government that are managing ports in different countries of the world, including Israel. Here was a proposal for a link through Thailand that would have allowed for a infrastructure link into the Kra Isthmus. You can see a motorway plan for the Karakoram Highway in Pakistan and how that fits in. Here's a focus on different canals that were proposed to cut across the Kra Isthmus, which is in Thailand. Thailand's friendly with China, historically been friendly, so that was always a proposal. But these canal proposals have come, generally they come from major powers that are seeking to avoid the Strait of Malacca, but it's unusual that large canals are built. The proposals for canals are much more common than actual canal constructions. that are completed. So here's unraveling the Belt and Road Initiative. Now the economic logic was China had excess construction workers and construction equipment, and so it simply exported those resources abroad and would loan money to countries to then contract these Chinese companies to do the work. The alternative was for that plant to be wasted and for those workers to have to retool and join another industry. Strategically, it allowed China to create infrastructure not only for commercial exports and importation of key resources, but also potentially places for their military to deploy. So it had an economic and a military strategic goal. This map shows the rail network in 2011 in the Eurasian landmass and how China could bypass a blockade and import fuel from Russia, Central Asia, and still maintain contact with its allies in the Near East through rail networks and pipelines that would run along them. Now this is a graphic representation of the rapid increase in the scale of fishing in the world. So you can see the map between 1950 and 2014, and in particular the huge increase of fishing off the coast of South America from at least the 1970s, as well as in the Indian Ocean and the Central Pacific. Now China is by far the biggest fishing country and the biggest aquaculture country. So China fishes 3 times more than Indonesia, which is more than India, which is more than the US, which is more than Russia, and then there's a sort of a steady decline in the scale of industrial fishing. But China grows almost 4 times as much fish in volume as it does through industrially along the rivers and aquaculture and lakes. And so it's far ahead of other countries in terms of growing fish for consumption. Now, obviously, this is problematic because when you're growing fish in a lake, there's a whole bunch of pollution issues. The open ocean is less likely to have high concentrations of mercury and lead and other industrial pollutants. In a lake, even if you've got runoff, it takes a long time to filter out those kinds of pollutants. And then, of course, there's problems with algae from the waste of fish. So those industries that do exist, have to be heavily regulated. So if you look at aquaculture in the U.S., it's 2/3 of 1% of the aquaculture in China. Now this means that China is probably, aside from being the best organized for aquaculture in the world, this is a significant part of its ability to resist a blockade, which is it can grow food in all its lakes and rivers, which other countries are far less equipped to do. Here again you can see millions of tons of fisheries, and you can see how much China is fishing. It's got aquaculture in the marine waters and inland waters, which are about 80% of all its fishing. And you can see the fisheries in the marine waters are significant, but again, it's a small proportion of the total marine fishing done by other countries in Asia. It's less than Europe, less than the Americas. So China's not wildly disproportional, but in aquaculture, it certainly has the lead. So here you can see Chinese fish imports and exports. So they're fairly even. So China does not depend on fishing only to eat. It's a commercial business. Now there have been some issues with the very large Chinese fleet aggressively fishing in the exclusive economic zones of other countries. And even if they don't, they create an atmosphere that is so overwhelming for the local Coast Guard ships that there's a lot of illegal fishing. And some observers have argued that up to 20% or even 30% of all fishing by Chinese vessels is illegal and is underreported. You can see here a big event in 2020 and 2021 off the Galapagos Islands of Ecuador. And here you can see the enormous increase in the quantity, the volume of fishing. I mean, it's grown ninefold since 1950, which is 70 years ago. And so you can see the enormous jump in aquaculture, particularly after 2000. With a focus on China alone, you can see the rise of marine fishing in about 1995 and how it's largely remained stable as a source of fish, and the enormous increase of agriculture from about 1995. Food security. China's population is 1/5 of the world's total population, yet China only has 7% of the world's arable land. Worse yet, it also only has 6.6% of the world's freshwater resources. China is self-sufficient in grain production, producing about 450 million tons of grain a year, although a drought could reduce that by up to 33%, and this could not be compensated for by the world trade of about 240 million tons of grain. China imports about 28.1 million tons of grain. The U.S. exports about 83 million tons out of a total production of 385 million. 75% of grain production is on irrigated land in China. Now, China could potentially raise its grain production to about 650 million in anticipation of its 2025 population of around 1.48 or 1.46 billion. So China suffers water scarcity like a great many countries, and this is worsening with climate change because the glacial waters that feed the Pearl River, the Yangtze, and the Huanghe, the Yellow River, are decreasing. Here you can see various levels of stress or water scarcity. The brown is the most water scarcity, and it is occurring in the Great Chinese Northern Plain, where about half of China's population lives. And so this is problematic. There are simply too many people there for the current water infrastructure. So China could certainly pipe in the water, as California does with very large state programs. But one of the big problems is that China's dependence on its rivers for water is problematic given the reduction in the water in the rivers from climate change. Now, China's had a dramatic change in its diet. This is what Chinese eat from importations in 2019. So there's dairy products, fresh fruit, beef, pork, wine, tree nuts. What's important is that the Chinese in 2022 actually consume more protein from meat than their American counterparts. And so there's been a dramatic cultural change, and this has been made possible by the huge increase in wealth in China, which now allows Chinese people who remember hunger to focus on much healthier foods. Caloric intake increased per capita in China from 1,011 to 4,620 per capita between 1949 and 2004. So the spring grain sowing season in northern China lacks water. Droughts, floods, and locusts have historically caused famine. In 1920 to 21, there were 500,000 deaths. Between 1928 and 1930, there was 2.5 million deaths from a famine. 23 to 30 million died from the Great Leap Forward, and it took until 1965 for food production to recover. So in the event of a food crisis, China could not buy its needed food with cash crops. It needs to cancel the cash crops and revert to food production. China's grain reserve is a state secret, but it's estimated that 229.7 million tons of grain, which is good for 2 years, is kept in storage. You can see here the Chinese people in the 1920s and 30s during one of the great famines. Although in China's case, it was associated with war. You can also see an unfortunate consequence of prosperity, which is the rise of obesity in China. Meat consumption. China's tripled its production of proteins from meat since 1986 and is self-sufficient, but increasing demand has rendered China an importer. China's goal is self-sufficiency in wheat and rice, but it allows the importation of corn feed for animals. China needs farm consolidation. The average Chinese farm is 1.6 acres against 400 acres in the US, making them far less profitable or efficient. But of course, consolidation would be politically unpopular. Here you can see China's supply and demand in wheat, and production has largely kept pace with consumption. Here you can see the increase of China's dependence on importation. Now, this importation is essentially both efficient and it's a luxury, because China still possesses enough arable land to feed its population in an emergency, assuming that it's made reservations and built up stocks. In 2022, it was reported that China stockpiled 18 months of food, largely as a consequence of the run on food costs because of the Russian war in Ukraine and because of COVID. Although China's unprecedented buying of the foodstuffs also was a contributor to the increase in prices. Here you can see China's agricultural imports from the world between 2001 and 2019. And the consumer-oriented component of that, which is, again, primarily protein. You can see the food-based imports by value. So it's primarily meat and its products, then fish, then dairy, then fruits, and then vegetable oil, grains, and then more luxury items like liquors and other items. Here you can see the largest food imports by country. There's New Zealand, which is providing a lot of China's dairy, Australia, Thailand providing rice, Indonesia, Brazil, US, Canada, France, Chile, and Russia. Again, this shows a breakdown of where China is purchasing its protein and food. You can see beef primarily comes from the US, poultry from the US, pork from the US, soybeans from the US, wheat from the US, and corn from the US. Military manufacturing. Since the end of the Second World War, China's created a large, heavy industrial base necessary for manufacturing the weapons for war: tanks, trucks, artillery, aircraft, and war and merchant ships, space vehicles, and computers. In the 1960s and 1970s, China created huge fleets of combat aircraft. It possessed 6,180 aircraft in 1987, as well as tanks. But most of these, MiG-15s, MiG-17s, and T-55s, have been withdrawn from service because of their obsolescence. China has a far more limited ability to produce modern military vehicles, with a production level of a few hundred per year. Its helicopter fleet is relatively small compared to Russia, which had 1,500 combat helicopters shortly after the collapse of the USSR. Its aircraft carrier fleet is small, and it's time-consuming. At the moment, it has only 2 carriers and one which is about to enter service. If you were to compare it to Japan, for example, which has manufactured a number of large cruisers that have some of the functions of aircraft carriers. In the last decade, China's managed to refurbish an aircraft carrier, has mastered airborne early warning technology for surveillance, mobile solid fuel rocketry, in-flight air-to-air refueling tankers, sophisticated satellites, drones, and stealth aircraft. China is still encountering difficulties with aircraft engines and special materials production. A good indicator of China's combat vehicle manufacturing ability is its road vehicle production rate as compared with other countries. Most of the manufacturers, however, started off being foreign companies like General Motors and Toyota, although China has rapidly replaced them with its own domestic manufacturing companies, and it has mastered the technology. So let's start by looking at the automobile stocks by country in 2019 and 2022. It should be remembered about 1/3 of all automobiles are actually trucks and buses and for industrial use. China has the largest number of automobiles in the world. It's got 322 million, of which 2.2 million are electric. This is followed by the US with 289 million, with 2.1 million electric vehicles, and then the European Union with 256 million vehicles, of which 1 million are electric. The automobile industry is important because it manufactures a lot of the terrestrial vehicles for war, like tanks, armored personnel carriers, and these sorts of weapons. So if China can manufacture this many cars, it could probably outproduce the US in weapons of war. You can see the graph at the bottom right, and the dark green is China in the bottom left corner, which shows the number of vehicles per inhabitant, which is 200, and the GDP per capita, which is about 10,000. And the light green in the center of the chart is the number of vehicles China would have if it achieved the same per capita or similar to the US, and it had a per capita of around 40,000. At that point, you're looking at 500 more vehicles, or 800, 900, or almost a billion road vehicles in China. So here's a comparative list of car manufacturing by millions of automobiles. Japan hit their peak in 1990, which is around the time their economy began to stagnate, and their market share decreased as other countries were copying many of the manufacturing techniques and quality control that the Japanese had. The US had their peak in 2000. And then China had their peak in 2017 at almost 30 million cars manufactured per year, cars, trucks, and buses. Although China passed by the US sometime in 2007 when it manufactured more cars. So this indicates that China's actually got conventional military purposed manufacturing on a larger scale than the US does. So in a war of attrition, if the US is not able to restrict the inputs into the Chinese economy, China can build more airplanes, more tanks, more ships, and would probably win in a long war. Here's a chart of the motor vehicles per person up until 2010, and you see that Chinese had very few vehicles. We're looking at maybe 20 motor vehicles per 1,000 people. And then we jump over to 2021, and we see China has jumped up to 200. So there was a 10-fold increase between 2009 and 2020 in the availability of cars per capita in China, which is an enormous increase in prosperity. Now we focus on shipbuilding. This is the overall increase globally in deadweight tons. A deadweight ton is the carrying capacity of the ship and not its actual weight. So between 2000 and 2020, we've had a 2.5 times increase in the ability of ships to carry cargo. And a lot of this is driven by China's growth as well as growth more broadly in the developing world. There are 119,000 merchant ships that are small, medium, large, and very large spread across the world. Although the vast majority of them, of course, are small. The top 10 flagging states for gross tonnage, this is the weight of the ships, not the deadweight tonnage of what they carry, are countries like Panama, Liberia, the Marshall Islands, Hong Kong, Singapore. These countries may not own the ship, but the ships are registered there, and the companies operate through these other authorities. China owns many of the ships that operate under the other flags. Although China is not the largest ship owner in the world, it does have a very large portion. And it's in some ways difficult to measure how many vessels are controlled by China. Although flagged in China, we have 5,100 merchant vessels. This is the share of the world's fleet owned by the top 15 countries. So you can see that China is the second largest owner after Greece. Greece owns 17.6% of the world's commercial shipping fleet, and China is at 11.6%. So in terms of shipbuilding, annually, the largest shipbuilder at the moment is South Korea. But China, South Korea, and Japan together control 94% of the total shipbuilding on the entire planet. What's left are specialized cruise ship vessels or crane ships that are built in Europe. And you've got another 2.8% of ships that are manufactured in the Philippines and Vietnam. So this shows you how concentrated shipbuilding is in Northeast Asia. So, of course, it doesn't mean Korea or Japan own the ship. I mean, they build a ship and then they sell it to a concern in Europe or South America. But they have the shipyards that are building the ships and the technology to do it cost effectively. This, of course, is explained by the relative cost of labor in shipbuilding. And you can see how countries like Germany have basically pulled themselves out of the market because of the high cost of manufacturing ships, and how Korea, South Korea, has maintained its position because it's able to undercut other countries. Here are the top 20 countries by fleet size of wide-body and narrow-bodied aircraft. And you see that China owns a lot of airplanes. Now, why do airplanes matter? Well, they're important for commerce, but also during wartime, they're repurposed to move personnel. During the U.S. buildup in 1990 to reverse Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, 90% of the equipment was moved by ship, but 90% of the people were flown in by commercial aircraft. So you can see that Canada's got a lot of aircraft as well, then the Russian Federation and United Kingdom. So China, in many ways, it's about half. It's got about half of the aviation that the U.S. does of large and narrow-bodied passenger and cargo aircraft. This is the total number of passengers carried. So you can see that China is about 2/3 of U.S. China has a very robust domestic air traffic system, and people move between the cities and in the region a lot compared to even the U.S. Here's aircraft possession of all types. This is presumably not drones, but it includes small airplanes like Cessnas and helicopters and larger aircraft, water bombers, military aircraft, all included. The U.S. has 9 million aircraft. China is at 1.8 million, Canada at 1.2, Germany at 1.1, and the U.K. at 1 million. But it shows you how China is a direct competitor with the U.S. in terms of aircraft. So now that we've seen the manufacturing capability of China in automobiles, shipping, and aircraft, we have a sense that their manufacturing capability is at this point stronger than the U.S. Even though the U.S. might have a 10-year or a 15 or a 20-year lead in some critical technologies, China can outproduce the U.S. at the moment, given the way that the industries are organized. What we want to look at now is what has China been doing with its manufacturing, and this is going to give us insight if what would happen in the event of a war. How much could China's industry be used to build and replace the weapons that are lost in combat? So in terms of strategic weapons, between 2012 and 2022, that's the last 10-11 years, the U.S. has reduced the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles in its silos by 50. It's retired 14 B-52s, and it's reduced its B-1B bomber fleet, which you can see a picture of here, by 21 aircraft. The only area strategically where the U.S. has increased was it put 38 new military satellites into orbit. So these weapons lists don't tell us what China and the U.S. have. They tell us what they've manufactured. Now, I've put the American weapons in red just to show you that not only is the American system static, but it's actually weakening over time without replacement. The Chinese, in the last 11 years, have built 30 DF-31 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 24 DF-4 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 110 DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, 54 CJ-100 cruise missiles that could potentially be nuclear. They've built 6 Type 094 Jin ballistic missile submarines and 121 military satellites. Now, China already has 2 Jin ballistic missile submarines, and it's got the hulls for the 7th and 8th under construction, hence this number of 6. So what we're looking at here are additions. The biggest increase in 10 years are the enormous number of satellites that China's been putting up. They've been putting up more than, approximately 1 satellite into orbit per month for the last 11 years. This is the naval buildup. So the U.S. has built 11 nuclear submarines, Virginia class, 1 Gerald Ford carrier. Before that, they built the George Bush, which was in 2009, before the period of this. So the Americans have added 11 submarines that are nuclear, 1 carrier, 2 Zumwalt cruisers, which are problematic, 7 Arleigh Burke destroyers, which are fairly important, powerful U.S. destroyers, 11 Independence frigates and 8 Freedom frigates, which are on the smallish side, and 10 Cyclone fast attack craft. China's added 4 nuclear submarines, about a third that the Americans have added, 14 diesel-electric submarines that operate locally off the coast of China, 3 aircraft carriers, 3 Type 055 Renhai cruisers. Those are very powerful vessels and meant to be the escorts for the aircraft carriers. 27 Luoyang 1-3 destroyers, which are fairly large ships. 32 frigates, 72 Jiandao corvettes, and 11 Huangfeng fast attack craft. China's built a large navy in only 10 years. Now, it's done this at the same time as retiring other ships, but this gives you an idea of the very strong industrial capability of China. We want to compare this to the German maritime buildup, the Wilhelmine German buildup before World War I, for about 1898 to 1914. That's a period of 16 years. Or we can compare it to the military buildup of Nazi Germany between 1932 and then the 7 years until 1939 when they invaded Poland. So in each of these individual years is crucial, and it's remarkable how much China has built up its navy and how little the U.S. has built up. You can see the U.S. Arleigh Burke in the bottom right picture. Very important to China is conquering Taiwan, and so the U.S., of course, being a continental island country, is also heavily focused on amphibious warfare. So the two states have maintained rough parity. So China's built the Yusheng LHD, which you can see with the helicopters. It's the top picture on the left column. Beneath it, there are 7 Yuzhou LPDs. So the Yusheng carries about 1,000 soldiers and maybe a platoon or 2 of tanks, and the Yuzhou carries about 500 soldiers. And then at the bottom, you've got the 5 Yuting landing craft tank, which are similar to the British logistical landing ships that they used during the Falklands War, and it can carry several armored vehicles. Now, compared to that are 2 American LHAs, which you can see is very similar to the US Yushin LHD. US, of course, has more experience, and plus the American vessel can carry about 1,500 soldiers, which is a slightly larger battalion. The U.S. also built 11 San Antonio LPDs, which can carry about 500 to 600 soldiers. And you can see the LCAC, or the hovercraft, at the bottom, of which the U.S. has 10. China's also built LCACs. But I've wanted to find something which equated with a Yuting, and this is the next closest thing that the Americans had. So China does not have enough in terms of these vessels that they've added in 10 years to land safely on the coast of Taiwan. They'd have to use a lot of civilian vessels. But the purpose of these forces is to land Marines who can then get a toehold with their floating armored vehicles, and then the rest of the Army can parachute in, come in by helicopter. They can seize a port and bring in ships with heavy regular Chinese Army forces. But they're more useful at this stage to capture islands. And again, this is in addition to other vessels that China had, of which there were not many before 2011. So this really shows a dedicated, marked increase by China. But also you can see that with the U.S. The U.S. has been building a lot of these amphibious vessels. The largest increase in China has been in aircraft. So the Americans have added, if you look at the right column, 6 E-2Ds. And this is sort of a net. I mean, they've got rid of some aircraft and they got some new aircraft, but net they had an increase of 6 airborne early warning aircraft. They've only added 12 F-22s in the whole period from 2012 to 2022. They have added a lot of F-35s. 279 F-35As, 112 F-35Bs, and 50 F-35Cs. They've added 157 Super Hornets. Now, a Super Hornet is like an F-18, but it's actually about 15% heavier, bigger, farther, carries a bigger payload. It looks like the same aircraft grown 15%. It is a different aircraft, and so I've basically counted it as a different aircraft. So the U.S. has built a lot of these. And the U.S. added 103 F-18 Growler aircraft for electronic warfare. Now, where the U.S. has its big weakness that I've put here, it's the U.S. retired 127 S-3 Viking anti-submarine warfare aircraft that you see in the picture of those two small pair of aircraft in the bottom right. Those aircraft were deployed on aircraft carriers in the year 2000, and they are very efficient at tracking and destroying enemy submarines. And the U.S. removed them from carriers and never replaced them. And this is a serious bureaucratic oversight given the threat that Chinese submarines would play in the event of a U.S. carrier having to approach Taiwan in a confrontation with China. Now, what has China added in this period? If you look at the left column on top, 89 H-6 bombers. These are Badger bombers. It is incredible that China is still manufacturing these things. These are relics from the 1950s. China's doing it because they basically are platforms to launch missiles. And so the B-52, which is the same age as the H-6, is still being used for the same reason, which is the H-6 and the B-52 themselves will not be in combat. They'll be standing off 1,000 nautical miles and firing from a great distance. Now, the next three rows are airborne early warning, AEW aircraft, and China's built a lot. In fact, there's been a huge increase in these aircraft, particularly the KJ-500. These aircraft are the most important aircraft in an air battle because they can see what's going on and they help coordinate aircraft, and this is a 1,000% increase in efficiency. Without these aircraft, a military air force cannot fight and win, and China's built over 30 of these. As we go down, China's added 50 J-15 carrier fighters for its aircraft carriers, 50 J-20 stealth aircraft. All of these have been manufactured in the last 5 years. 20 KQ-200 maritime aircraft for anti-submarine warfare. So the Chinese are finally creating a long-range maritime capability to reach out and chase American submarines or Japanese submarines. There are 31 Y-20 heavy transports. This is very important. During the Cold War, the Americans can move very large military forces right across the planet using heavy transports. China is now approaching that capability, and some of their Air Force people have asked for 250 of these aircraft. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But it gives China enormous global flexibility. In the last 10 years, China's built 324 J-10s, 172 J-16s, and 155 J-11s. It's in some ways, these are fifth-generation aircraft, which means they're not stealth. At least these aircraft are not stealth at the bottom. But in attrition against older U.S. F-16s or F-15s or F-18s, China and the U.S. are almost indistinguishable. So the U.S. is falling behind. It should probably have built more F-22s. Now, the U.S. has not kept pace in the field of military army equipment because it thinks that most of the engagement with China will be with air forces, sea forces, and marines. There might be some role for the army to play if China expands a war to include the Russian Far East or India. And the U.S. has also been retooling since its 25 years of interventions in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And so it's got a lot of road vehicles, or LAV-25s, and other vehicles used by the Army and Marines, which they're basically warehousing or giving off to allies. So the U.S. has only, in the last 10 years, increased its inventory by 43 Apache helicopters and 139 M777 155mm towed guns. China, in the same time, has increased its inventory by 700 Type 99 tanks, 700 Type 96 tanks, 50 ZTD light tanks, 400 ZTQ-15 light tanks, 1,000 ZT-11 assault guns, which are these armored vehicles with a big cannon, 194 155 self-propelled guns, 300 155 self-propelled guns, a total of 1,050 122mm self-propelled guns, and 284 attack helicopters, which is bringing China's helicopter force closer to the scale that the U.S. has. So all of this shows us that China's been building up quite aggressively. Its industry is much stronger than it was in 2000. It's now probably able to outproduce the U.S. in peacetime, as it is, and if the U.S. were to decide to compete with it, and in wartime. So we're returning to a situation with the Soviet Union. There was a political willingness to focus manufacturing on weapons. In China, you don't need political will. The economy is so large, they can just have 3% of their economy dedicated to this manufacturing, and they would naturally outproduce the U.S., even if the U.S. was investing a comparable amount, because China's proportion of the economy that's manufacturing is larger than the proportion of the American economy that's manufacturing. Now, another major issue, of course, is China developing dams to get electrical power, to harness hydroelectric power. But already this has reduced the level of water in rivers like the Mekong. And so this is a major strategic headache, because if China reduces the water supply to its neighbors, it could be a casus belli. Here we can see some of the dams indicated by a black rectangle laid over the rivers that are affecting the flow of rivers that go through Bangladesh and India, which is, Bangladesh is a Chinese friendly state. You can see here some of the rivers in the Himalayas of China and how they're being dammed, as well as the impact of the dams on Southeast Asia, which again, it affects American allies like Thailand and Cambodia, and provokes countries like Laos and Vietnam. Here again, you can see some of the proposed dams along the Salween River that goes through China's ally, Burma or Myanmar. Here you can see the renewable water resources per river basin indicated by the orange circles. So you can see a lot of these are in the Himalayan areas of China, which would have a negative impact on China's Southeast Asian and South Asian allies. Here's a map of different critical raw materials, particularly rare earths, that are listed in China. So China claims that it's got a hold on rare earths, but this is in fact not true. The problem with rare earths is that they're toxic to mine, but they are relatively plentiful. Countries like Japan and Sweden have identified sources for these minerals. The problem is just the health and safety aspect significantly increases the extraction cost. But these minerals are very important for virtually every system of modern electronics and communication and computer engineering. China is one of the biggest miners in the world, including minerals and fuels in the form of coal and iron. And you compare that with coal in the US and Russia, Australia, India. Saudi Arabia, of course, is mostly oil. But you can see that the proportion of iron and ferrous precious metals. China extracts slightly less than Australia. So now we deal with some political science. Now, Daniel Dresner wrote an article examining the issue of debt and financial influence. So there's some concern that the level of bond indebtedness of the U.S. to China makes it politically vulnerable to geopolitical pressure from Beijing. It is feared that the loss of credit to the U.S. would result in a domestic economic shock to the U.S. economy, particularly since the fragility of the recovery after the 2008 crisis. In 2008, China replaced Japan as the largest holder of U.S. debt at $1.5 trillion. Now, has China been able to convert this economic influence into political power over the U.S.'s foreign policy? The U.S., for example, used financial pressure to force the British and the French out of Egypt in 1956. You can see here the index of foreign exchange reserves held by China until 2013. So some of Dresner's theoretical findings. 1. There's often an alternative credit for large states. 2. Financial leverage works between asymmetric powers, in other words, great powers against small powers, but generally fails between equivalent powers, such as between, say, Japan and the US in 1940, because they can retaliate against each other by closing off financial or market access. Number 3, states are vulnerable to financial pressure if their population is vulnerable to shock, which is unlikely among large developed states. Number 4, financial pressure works best against a fixed monetary regime, which is atypical for large developed states. Financial pressure may cause some volatility, but the market will quickly reevaluate the currency on the market in relation to the output of goods. So Dresner's empirical findings. 1. The U.S. has significant alternate sources of credit because it's viewed by investors, even by China, as one of the safest investment havens in the world. Number 2. If China reduced its U.S. debt, the dollar would depreciate opposite the renminbi, and China's exports to the U.S. would fall. A 10% drop in the U.S. dollar would produce a 3% loss of China's financial reserves. Number 3, China and the U.S. would suffer mutual shock if the system is unbalanced. The U.S. market is vital to China's growth. Number 4, China, not the U.S., maintains a fixed exchange rate and is therefore vulnerable to a financial run on its currency, if it were fully convertible, which it is not. Here you can see the U.S.'s trading partners on the left. You can see that China is important. It's one of the maroon colors on the left side of the gray bar in the center. China trades with the U.S. slightly more than all other Asian countries combined, but it's about the same as Europe, same as trade from Mexico and Canada combined, and about the same as all of South America and the rest of the world combined. In terms of exports, the U.S. doesn't export that much to China. It mostly exports to other countries in the Americas, Canada and Mexico. So within that context, we can look at the chart on the top right, which is the trade imbalance. In general, America imports more from China than it exports, and this creates an imbalance of payments, which is basically resolved to the detriment of the U.S. So who does the U.S. owe government to in terms of debt? And that's pie graph you can see at the bottom right. And you'll see that China, which is the light brown or yellow-ish, orange-ish, China and Hong Kong are only 4.4%, which is less than Japan. So you see here that China is no longer one of the leading countries that the U.S. owes funding to. In fact, the United Kingdom is 4.5%. So the U.S. owes more to the UK than it does to China. It owes 3% to Belgium, Ireland, and Luxembourg. And so it's diversified. Now, a second issue is the relationship between economic interdependence and war. And Dale Copeland elaborated this theory both to explain why Germany and England fought in the First World War, but also to try to anticipate the incentives for China to attack the US, despite the fact that those two countries are each other's large trading partners. So the liberal trade thesis is that trade promotes peace. Trade fosters peaceful relations by creating middle classes that pressure governments to democracy to avoid costly conflicts. Trade should therefore be promoted if you're pursuing peace. The explanation is that trade permits the additional wealth production accruing from specialization of comparative advantage. Now, the economic growth hypothesis argues that trade leads to war. The continued growth of China will increase its relative power and lead to a conflict as China asserts that power. Trade should therefore be limited, and China should be contained like the Soviet Union. The explanation of the economic growth hypothesis is that states are inclined to maximizing their security by maximizing their autarky and minimizing their dependence on other states. So we have our puzzle. Europe in 1913 was highly economically integrated, but war resulted anyway in 1914, the First World War. The British and the Germans in particular were each other's heaviest trading partners. The Germans would sell their goods into the British Empire. So the question is, will trade interdependence between the US and China promote peace or war? So Copeland reformulates the hypothesis. The likelihood of war depends on the expectations of future trade. If future trade is estimated to be positive, the state will be inclined to peace. If, however, the state assesses the prospects for trade as negative, the state will be inclined to offensive action to secure resource autarky. Now, the explanation in what Copeland calls the theory of trade expectations is that states will choose whether to prepare for war or not, depending on the anticipated value of their continued trading versus four factors. 1, the anticipated losses from a cutoff of trade. 2, the cost of war. 3, the payoff from victory. And 4, the probability of victory. Now, in its first case, Germany, besides trading heavily with the UK in 1913, built a large navy and prepared for war against the UK in anticipation that the UK would eventually cut Germany off from world trade. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the Germans, of course, built a fleet provoking the English, who then planned to cut off Germany. Case number 2. Japan was eager to trade with the US and the outside world in the 1920s, but the protectionism of the 1930s drove Japan towards autarky and seeking a military path to establish an East Asian co-prosperity sphere. The US, by cutting off Japanese access to the US market, set the conditions for a future expectation of the cutoff of trade. Japan outlined its plan to occupy Southeast Asia in 1936 in the, quote, fundamentals of our national policy, close quote, in which the Navy and the Army had to be ready to act in the event of any further cutoff of trade. You can see here Japan's co-prosperity sphere. It would first secure the oil in Southeast Asia, particularly the Dutch East Indies. It would use the coal and minerals from Manchukuo. It would use the labor of China. And then it would build a defensive barrier, including the islands in the Pacific, to keep the US and its allies at bay. So this was Japan's co-prosperity sphere in East Asia. In Copeland's third case, the calculus for war by China is the benefit of trade expectations versus the losses suffered by a cutoff, times the cost of fighting the US, the likelihood of victory, and the resources obtained if China were to win. So the dilemma is, continued cooperation with China will aid it to grow in relative power. China's trade with the US furnishes it with the capital needed to buy military weapons from Russia and production technology from Japan and Europe. So what is the overall assessment? How strong is China's war economy? Number one, China is well equipped to mass produce 1970s level Army helicopter, ships, and aircraft technology, and a smaller production capacity for 1980s and 1990s technology, including fifth generation aircraft. However, it has far fewer equivalent military assets as compared with the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s. The USSR peaked with submarines in 1961 with 430 submarines and 1988 with 280 submarines, whereas China had a peak of only 117 submarines in 1987 and now has 71. During the Cold War, the US peaked at 101 in 1987, down to 57 in 2013. Number two, it is also not clear how convertible China's industries are for large-scale military production, as compared with the US or USSR during the Second World War, for example. A China isolated by an economic blockade may suffer a significant contraction of its economy until it could restructure its industry. The Soviet economy dropped from 2.48 trillion in 1989, which is about 50% of the US economy, to just 1.1 trillion in 1991, which was 15% of the US economy. Number three, China is very susceptible to blockades of its trade, energy importation, food security, rendering it vulnerable to social disruption of its war effort. Starvation in its rural areas can be contained, and much of its energy use is for non-essential domestic consumption. However, its food vulnerability has little excess capacity. Were it to be mechanized, it would be dependent upon fossil fuels for its continued operation.